Hey guys, I am the narrator of the Western story. Now, let's begin the story. The desert stretched out like an ocean of dust, endless and merciless beneath the midday sun. Heat shimmered in waves above the ground, bending the horizon, turning every shape into a wavering ghost. The land was raw, untamed, an unforgiving stretch where only the stubborn survived. And at the heart of this wasteland stood Dry Creek, a town clinging to life like a thorn bush in sand. Its main street was a line of tired buildings, a weather-beaten saloon with doors that creaked like old bones, a sheriff's office that leaned too much to the left, and a scattering of storefronts whose paint had long since surrendered to the desert wind. Dust coated everything. The air smelled of sweat, horse, and whiskey, the fragrance of survival. Jed Morrow rode slow into that town, his silhouette cut sharp against the blazing sky. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his eyes, but the set of his jaw told stories that no man asked out loud. His horse was a chestnut stallion, ribs showing, hooves crunching against hardpan. With every step, the town seemed to hold its breath. Jed was not a stranger, but neither was he kin. He was something heavier, an old echo returning to settle debts. Saloon doors swung open at his approach, the sound cracking through the silence. Inside, laughter stumbled and fell quiet as boots crossed the threshold. Jed's presence was like a cold wind slipping into a warm room. He walked to the bar, movements slow, deliberate. "Whiskey," he said, voice low as gravel. The barkeep poured without a word. In this land, some men earned silence the way others earned coin. Jed lifted the glass, amber catching the light, but his eyes weren't on the drink. They were on the mirror behind the bar, watching the room without watching. Around him, murmurs spread. Old-timers squinted, recognizing him. Young men leaned forward, curious about the legend standing alive before them. To some, Jed Morrow was a name out of campfire tales, gunfights whispered about under the stars. To others, he was a warning, the kind of man whose shadow could stretch longer than daylight. But Jed hadn't come back for whiskey, nor for the comfort of memory. He carried the weight of business unfinished, trouble that had waited long enough. His silence spoke louder than any announcement. And in a town where silence could be as sharp as a blade, folks understood. Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling shutters, carrying the smell of dust and iron. A storm was coming, though the sky stayed clear. It wasn't nature's storm, it was human, born of grudges, lawlessness, and the kind of reckoning that always leaves scars. Sheriff Holt watched from his office window, a man whose star had lost its shine. He knew the past Jed carried, and he knew the town wasn't ready for it to walk their streets again. But readiness didn't matter. The West never asked if you were ready. Jed finished his drink, set the glass down with a soft thud, and turned. Eyes followed him as he stepped back into the sun, his boots striking the boards with the rhythm of inevitability. Trouble had arrived in Dry Creek, not loud, not sudden, but steady, certain, like the ticking of a clock that had finally run down. The sun began its slow crawl westward, dragging the town of Dry Creek into longer shadows. Heat still pressed heavy on the boards of the saloon porch and shimmered in the dust along Main Street. The town looked the same, but the air had shifted. Every man, woman, and child felt it. The return of Jed Morrow carried weight, and weight changed everything. A boy chased a stray dog past the general store, but his laughter faltered when he saw Jed leaning against a post, hat low, eyes on the horizon. Jed's silence was a warning bell, though no one could hear the clapper strike. Inside the saloon, whispers took root and grew into stories. "That's him, ain't it? Jed Morrow. They say he once shot 3 men in the time it took a 4th to draw breath." Another voice cut in, low and uncertain. "Or maybe it was 2 men and a sheriff. Depends on who's telling." In the West, legends never held still long enough to be measured. At the far end of town, Sheriff Holt lit a cigar and let it burn slow. His badge still caught the light, but the man wearing it had grown tired. Jed's return was a storm on his doorstep, and Holt knew he couldn't sweep it aside with the usual talk of law. This wasn't law. This was history come calling, and history didn't knock. It kicked the door open. As dusk pulled its dark coat over Dry Creek, the saloon filled again. Card games spread across green tables. Coins clinked, and a piano player stumbled through half a tune. Folks wanted distraction, but every sound felt like prelude. Nobody could play loud enough to cover the tension. Jed took a seat in the corner, where the light was thin. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't offering himself either. Men glanced at him and then looked away too quick, as if staring might summon something best left alone. His hand rested on the table near the holster, not touching it, but near enough that the thought hung heavy in the air. A woman in a red dress walked past, balancing a tray of glasses. Her eyes flicked toward him just once, and that single look said more than a speech. She knew men like Jed. They carried danger the way others carried dust on their boots, natural, inevitable. The night stretched long, and the moon climbed silver over the desert. Coyotes howled from the ridges, their voices blending with the piano's broken notes. Jed stayed still, but inside his chest, the past was stirring. He hadn't come for cards, whiskey, or women's eyes. He'd come because the trail of unfinished business always leads back. Always. Somewhere, beyond the town's edge. Another rider watched the glow of lanterns and listened to the coyotes. Trouble wasn't only inside Dry Creek, it was circling, waiting. And soon, the town would learn that one man's return could open doors no one meant to open. Jed raised his glass, the whiskey burning down deep. His eyes didn't leave the door. He knew the next shadow to step through might carry the weight of his reckoning. Morning came to Dry Creek with no mercy. The desert sun climbed fast, pouring heat into every crack of the street and painting the sky with a white glare. Dust clung to boots, and even the horses shifted uneasily, their flanks damp with sweat before the day had truly begun. Jed Morrow was already awake. He sat outside the boarding house, hat tipped back, coffee cooling in his hand. His eyes followed the road that stretched east, where the horizon shimmered like a blade. Folks passed by with careful greetings, short nods, hushed mournings, as if the weight of his presence made their throats dry. By noon, talk had reached every corner. Riders were coming. Not merchants, not drifters, men with guns, men who carried business carved into scars. The kind of riders who didn't mistake Dry Creek for just another town. They came hunting, and everyone knew who they came for. Sheriff Holt walked down Main Street, his badge catching light, his steps slower than he liked. He stopped near Jed. "You expecting company?" Holt asked, voice even, though the air felt tight between them. Jed didn't look up. "I'm not expecting..." I'm remembering. There's a difference. Holt chewed his cigar and spat. He knew better than to press. Jed carried his answers like he carried his revolver, hidden until the moment demanded. By late afternoon, riders appeared on the ridge. 4 of them. Their silhouettes were sharp against the burning sky, like vultures waiting to descend. They didn't rush. They took their time, letting Dry Creek see the shape of trouble before it stepped closer. Inside the saloon, fear spread like spilled whiskey. Men shuffled cards without playing. Women drew curtains though the sun was still high. Even the piano sat silent, its keys untouchable. Everyone felt the town pause, waiting for the next move. Jed rose from his chair, brushing dust from his coat. He didn't hurry. His steps matched the slow beat of hooves as the riders came down. He walked toward the street, the way a man walks toward a storm he's already met once before. The first rider entered the street, horse kicking up dirt. His face was narrow, with eyes that gleamed like knives. The others fanned out behind him. They didn't call names, didn't waste words. The silence was its own declaration. Jed stood at the center of Maine, hand near but not on his gun. The crowd gathered in doorways, breaths shallow. Sheriff Holt kept his hand on the butt of his own revolver, but his eyes stayed on Jed. This was Jed's storm, not his. The lead rider finally spoke, voice hard as the desert floor. Jed Morrow. You knew we'd come. Jed's gaze stayed level, calm as a rattler before the strike. I knew you'd never stop. The air tightened. Somewhere, a church bell gave a single hollow ring. Time slowed, stretching thin. This wasn't just a fight waiting to happen. This was history circling back, demanding payment. And everyone in Dry Creek knew the town was about to witness whether Jed Morrow's legend was a story, or the kind of truth written in gun smoke. The street of Dry Creek turned into a stage, and every man, woman, and child in town became unwilling witnesses. Dust hung in the air, lit gold by the sinking sun, and silence pressed down heavier than any sermon. Jed Morrow stood alone in the center, his boots planted, his hat casting a shadow that cut across his face. Across from him, the 4 riders spread out, their horses blowing steam, their saddles creaking with each shift of weight. These were not strangers. These were old ghosts wearing skin and iron. The lead rider smirked, teeth flashing white against sunburnt skin. You left debts, Jed. Debts don't fade. They just wait. Jed's voice carried steady, not loud, but strong enough for the town to hear. I paid my price already. You just don't like the currency. The crowd stirred, whispers darting between windows. They'd all heard stories about Jed's past, gunfights in border towns, jobs done in shadows, blood spilled for reasons too tangled to unravel. But this was no story. This was reckoning. Sheriff Holt stepped onto the boardwalk, his jaw clenched. He called out, "This is a town, not a graveyard. Take it elsewhere." The riders didn't even glance at him. Their eyes stayed locked on Jed. In their silence was an answer. This town was about to become a graveyard if it had to. Jed shifted his weight, slow as drifting smoke. His right hand hovered near his holster, not touching, just waiting. He had been in more standoffs than most men had seen winters, but each one still demanded its own soul. The second rider leaned forward in his saddle. "You got lucky before. You won't today." Jed tilted his head, almost a shrug. Luck's got nothing to do with steady hands. The sun kissed the rooftops, bleeding the sky orange. Shadows stretched long across the street, cutting the space between them into strips of light and darkness. The tension snapped thin. Then it happened. The riders moved first, hands diving, steel flashing. The sound of gunfire tore through the stillness, sharp as thunder, splitting stone. Horses reared, screams rang from doorways, and the street filled with chaos. Jed's revolver cleared leather in a blur. One shot cracked, precise as a clock strike, and the second rider slumped sideways, boots slipping from stirrups. Another bullet followed, quick and cold, catching the third man before his gun leveled. The lead rider fired wild, bullets sparking off posts. Jed pivoted, dust swirling around him, and his third shot cut the man down. Silence returned, broken only by the echo of the last gunshot fading into the hills. The fourth rider, youngest of the bunch, froze with his pistol trembling in hand. His breath came ragged, eyes wide. Jed aimed but didn't fire. "Go," Jed said, voice low, heavy as stone. "Tell the world what you saw here. Tell them Dry Creek isn't a hunting ground." The rider swallowed hard, then yanked his reins. His horse bolted, hooves hammering the ground until the figure vanished into horizon dust. Jed lowered his gun, the weight of it suddenly heavier than before. The townsfolk crept back into the street, eyes wide, awe mixed with fear. Sheriff Holt exhaled, shoulders dropping, though he kept his gaze sharp on Jed. The town was alive, but it had seen death walk through, carried by the hand of one man. And as the sun dipped fully behind the ridge, the question remained: how long could Jed Morrow keep outrunning the shadows of his own past? Night dropped hard on Dry Creek, a black sky scattered with stars sharp as nails. The town still breathed shallow, as if afraid to disturb the memory of gunfire that lingered in the dust. Jed Morrow sat alone on the porch of the saloon, hat tipped low, a bottle of rye resting at his boots. His revolver lay on the table beside him, cleaned, oiled, and quiet. The silence pressed close, broken only by the creak of wood and the far-off cry of a coyote. Inside, voices whispered over whiskey glasses. Folks spoke Jed's name like it was both blessing and curse. To some, he'd saved the town. To others, he'd brought danger that never would have come otherwise. Sheriff Holt pushed through the saloon doors, boots thumping slow. He stopped near Jed, studying him under the lantern's glow. "You draw too fast for peace to stay long," Holt said. Jed took a slow sip, eyes fixed on the horizon where darkness swallowed the hills. "Peace was never mine to keep, Sheriff, just mine to borrow." The lawman frowned. Those men weren't the end. They'll send more. Jed nodded once. He knew. The past didn't forgive, it followed. From the corner of the street, a boy, barely 12, watched with wide eyes. Jed saw him, gave the faintest nod. The boy clutched an old hat too big for his head and whispered something to himself. Maybe a prayer, maybe a vow. Jed remembered being that young, when heroes looked larger than bullets and a steady hand seemed enough to build a life. But Jed knew better. Heroes carried scars no one wanted to touch. Later, in a rented room above the saloon, Jed unrolled a worn map across the table. Candlelight flickered over trails, rivers, towns marked with faded ink. His finger traced a line westward toward country he hadn't seen in years, maybe toward a place where memory wouldn't follow so quick. But he stopped at a name scrawled in the margin: Elkhorn Ridge. His jaw tightened. That was where it had started, the job gone wrong, the betrayal that had branded him an outlaw in more counties than he could count. And the men who came for him tonight, they weren't just looking for revenge. They were messengers. Morning came with a pale light that did little to soften the tension hanging over Dry Creek. Dust swirled lazy in the streets, but the silence carried weight, as if the whole town was bracing for a storm that had yet to break. Jed Morrow stepped out from his room above the saloon, boots striking the boards with steady rhythm. He carried his Colt low on his hip, not as a threat, but as a truth. Men whispered when he passed. Mothers pulled their children close, and the air smelled faintly of fear mixed with coffee and coal smoke. Sheriff Holt waited near the jailhouse, leaning against the rail. His eyes narrowed at the horizon where the ridges burned in the morning sun. "Riders out there," Holt said. "Not townsfolk. Armed." Jed's gaze followed. Black dots moved slow across the far ridge, deliberate as vultures. He knew the kind, guns for hire, drawn by the promise of bounty money. "They'll test the town first," Jed muttered. "Find its weak spots before they burn it down." By noon, word spread fast. Merchants packed shutters. Farmers hitched wagons and argued about fleeing or fighting. The church bell rang not for prayer, but for warning. Inside the saloon, talk turned sharp. "We can't stand against hired killers." One man spat. "Maybe we can if he leads," another countered, eyes darting to Jed. Jed said nothing. He sat at the bar, hands folded, hat low. He wasn't looking to lead. He wasn't looking to stay. But every word tossed his name into the center of the room, branding him the choice the town didn't want but might need. As dusk bled across the sky, the first shot cracked in the distance. Not close, not yet, just a test. Horses whinnied. Lamps flickered to life. Shadows stretched long on the street, and Dry Creek held its breath. Jed rose, checked the weight of his revolver, and spoke at last. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "They're coming. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. But make no mistake, this town is the stage, and we're already on it." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "And you, Morrow, what's your part in all this?" Jed pulled his hat down, eyes steady on the door. "My part's the same as it ever was. Stand where I'm needed. Walk when I'm not." The piano stood silent. The crowd waited. And outside, the horizon swallowed the last light, leaving only the promise of steel and blood. Night swallowed Dry Creek in a hush broken only by the groan of wagons and the nervous shifting of horses. The streets lay bare, every window shuttered, every lamp dimmed low. Yet the town was wide awake, listening for the thunder of hooves. Jed Morrow stood at the end of Main Street, his silhouette cut against the glow of lantern light. Beside him, Sheriff Holt adjusted the rifle in his hands, jaw set tight. Around them, a handful of townsmen gripped old shotguns, hunting rifles, even farm tools sharpened in haste. They weren't soldiers, They were fathers, brothers, men cornered by fate. A low rumble rolled in from the ridge. Then the riders appeared. Shadows first, then shapes. A pack of hard men on hard horses, rifles glinting in the pale moonlight. Their laughter carried cold across the night air, the sound of men who had killed before and meant to kill again. One rider spurred forward, a scarred man with a voice that split the quiet. Hand over the law, man. Hand over the stranger. And maybe the rest of you keep breathing. The words hung heavy. The townsfolk shifted uneasily. A farmer's hands trembled so hard the barrel of his shotgun knocked against the rail. Jed stepped forward, calm as stone. His coat brushed against the dust, and the town seemed to draw strength from the steadiness of his stride. "You came a long way to die tired," he said, voice even but cutting. The riders answered with gunfire. Bullets tore splinters from the boardwalk. Windows shattered. The town erupted in chaos. Jed dropped behind a trough, his Colt flashing in rhythm. Each shot was measured, not wasted, not rushed. A rider toppled. Another cursed and wheeled his horse. Sheriff Holt fired from the jailhouse steps, his rifle barking thunder into the night. The street filled with smoke and dust. Horses screamed. Lamps burst. The townsfolk fired clumsy but desperate, each shot a prayer against the dark tide pressing in. Through the chaos, Jed moved with purpose. He crossed the open street under a hail of bullets, drew a bead, and dropped the scarred man who had spoken first. The outlaw fell silent, and for a heartbeat so did the world. But the fight was far from over. More riders poured from the ridge, their numbers greater than the town had feared. The ground shook under their charge, and the night became a storm of lead. Jed reloaded, calm even as grit stung his face. He looked to Holt and spoke low, a vow carried between the shots. "This won't be over quick, but we'll hold. We have to." The sheriff gave a sharp nod, and as the riders closed in, Dry Creek stood at the edge of fire and fate, with Jed Morrow its last line between survival and ruin. The street of Dry Creek was fire and thunder. Gunshots cracked, windows shattered, and smoke rolled across the wooden facades. Men fought from rooftops. Women dragged the wounded into cover. This wasn't just a battle. It was the town's last breath being fought for in dust and blood. Jed Morrow moved steady, each shot of his Colt exact, each step forward against the tide. He wasn't hunting glory. He was making sure the children in the church cellar would see morning. Sheriff Holt's voice cut through the chaos, rallying men who had never held a rifle in anger before. They stood, trembling but unbroken. Through the smoke came the outlaw leader, black coat whipping, shotgun blazing. He rode hard, straight for Jed. The town held its breath as the two locked eyes. The horse thundered forward. The shotgun fired. Splinters burst from a trough. Jed didn't flinch. One shot from his Colt answered true. The outlaw tumbled into the dirt, silence falling heavier than the gunpowder haze. The riders scattered. Dry Creek lived. Townsfolk wept, embracing the wounded, laying the fallen gently aside. Sheriff Holt whispered, "You saved us." Jed pulled his hat low. "I just bought time. Trouble always comes back." He mounted his horse, the dawn rising at his back. Dry Creek had bled but had not broken. And in the hush of morning, one truth lingered like smoke in the air. Courage is not about victory. It's about standing tall when fear tells you to fall.